Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for the launch event of the OECD report, The Contribution of Migration to Regional Development. My name is Lukas Kanröschkamp, and I will moderate the event today. Before we start, let me please give you a few details about the event. After a short presentation of some of the report's main findings, we'll have two exciting roundtables today with great speakers, policymakers and academic experts on migration and regional development. During the panel discussions, you, the participants, can ask questions via the chat function that can then be included in our discussions today. Without further ado, I'd like to give the word to Nadim Ahmad, the Deputy Director of the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities.
Thanks, Lucas, and good morning, afternoon and evening to all of you out there. Now, I've spoken at many events with the beginning that emphasizes just how timely and important the event was, but I don't think that any of that's really necessary today. I mean, the unfolding humanitarian crisis in Ukraine with 2 million refugees fleeing the war, I think speaks to the importance of today's event and indeed today's report, far better than I could possibly hope to convey in words. So before I begin, perhaps with a few additional words, speaking to that importance, I did want to take the opportunity of first thanking Louis Jextra and DG Regio of the European Commission for their generous and excellent support throughout this process. I also wanted to say a special thank you to the OECD team, Lucas, Cam, Cem and Jasper in our Centre for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities for their excellent and diligent work in delivering this report. And also, perhaps really importantly, in delivering a powerful new evidence base that will help us collectively continue to improve our understanding of migrants and how we can fully leverage on their potential, not just for the countries and regions that host them, but also for them too. And last, but certainly not least, I just wanted to say a big thank you to all the speakers that we have with us today. I think what will certainly be an exciting event. So let's begin perhaps with some scene setting by way of me just painting a brief picture on the scale of that potential. So even before the wave of refugees from Ukraine, who will now be afforded the benefits of de facto migrant status in the EU, following the Commission's positive plan to give 3-year protection to Ukrainian refugees and via access to employment and also welfare. Migrant shares within OECD countries were large, amounting to 13% of the population in the OECD as a whole, and over 25% in Australia, New Zealand and Switzerland, and 45% in Luxembourg. Indeed, over the last decade, over 5 million new permanent migrants have settled in OECD countries. That's an increase of 25%. Now, most of those migrants settle in large and densely populated places. And in fact, more than 80% of all migrants live in metropolitan regions with more than 250,000 inhabitants. And on average, the share of migrants varies by 15 percentage points across regions within countries. Now, at the same time, many regions in OECD countries are also facing aging populations, with 30% of them shrinking. So given these facts, it seems perhaps obvious that the geographical dimension of migration will be high on the radar screen, and in particular, the analytical radar screen. But far from it, despite the scale of migration, the localized impacts, and indeed the really high political attention around the issue, there remains very little evidence looking at the challenges and opportunities associated with migration at the local level, where migrants live, work, and integrate. And today's report, and the two novel data sets it gave birth to, is a really important effort again to begin to fill that lacuna. And the first of those databases, and you'll hear more in both of the data sets from Lucas in his presentation to follow, so I'm not going to steal his thunder. The first database extends and updates our existing OECD regional database to cover more countries, 36 countries now, over 2 decades, and with more indicators, 120 of them, all covering the distribution, the education and labour market outcomes of migrants across OECD regions. And the second of those data sets, the municipal migration database, offers unprecedented granular information to measure and consistently compare changes in migration settlement patterns across municipalities in 22 OECD countries, again over the last 2 decades. Using that new data, the report provides new insights on the role of migration on regional development and highlighting opportunities and challenges for integrating migrants successfully in regional economies. And it provides an abundance of evidence to demonstrate exactly what success looks like. In particular, the evidence that points to positive impacts on growth, especially in lagging regions, on innovation, and in turn on trade, where migrants are able to leverage on and create networks to their home regions. At the same time, it provides evidence and challenges, in particular short-term challenges on labour markets, especially in poorer regions and for lower skilled native workers, where effective and supportive policies will be needed to mitigate negative impacts and help them adjust. And the evidence on longer-term impact on labour markets certainly suggests that those investments can pay off. And there are, of course, challenges for migrants too, particularly non-EU migrants in the EU who have a 10 percentage point lower employment rate than EU migrants, and especially for female migrants. And we need to make sure that the right policies are in place to support them too, so they can fully capitalise on their potential. The potential that was all too evident during the pandemic, with migrants playing a key role as key workers delivering essential services. Indeed, 1 in 4 doctors in OECD cities has a migrant background. But we all need to ensure that our regions have the right capacities in place that allow migrants to effectively integrate. And I'm minded to note that this is certainly more important than ever, especially as many of the countries and regions now accommodating refugees from Ukraine have much more limited experience with large-scale integration of migrants in their societies and labour markets. And so fast access to the labour market will be crucial, which is again why the Commission's plans on this front are so welcome. I mean, not least given the evidence showing how improved labour market attachment can also help to reduce emotional damages. So on that positive note, I'm going to stop there. You'll hear an awful lot more about the report from the presentation that Lucas is about to give. And I'll just close my intervention here and pass the floor back to you, Lucas. But I'm really looking forward to a lively and interesting discussion. Many thanks all again for joining us.
Great. Thank you very much, Nadim. I'll share my screen and then we move on to we'll continue with the short presentation of the OECD report. The OECD's work on migration and regional development over now the past 3 years has pursued primarily 3 objectives that mainly, as Nadim already alluded to, aim to address data gaps and improve our collective understanding of the role of migration for regional development. In more detail, the 3 objectives that we pursued are the following. First, to provide more comprehensive regional data and analysis on migration and migrants. As a result, we make now publicly available a new data set for large regions, tier 2 regions we call them, that covers almost all OECD countries, 36, for around 20 years and with more than 120 indicators on migrants, geographic location, on changes in the distribution of migrants, on their education background, on their labor market performance, and so on. The second objective was to really offer greater granularity. That means going beyond large regions, having data that is much more detailed, spatially detailed. To that end, we have collected novel data for municipalities and small districts. And as a result, the new OECD Municipal Migration Database enables a much finer assessment of spatial differences and allows various aggregations to different geographies on migrant statistics, such as small regions, metropolitan areas, or the degree of urbanization. Again, I would like to emphasize that those 2 new data sets become now publicly available as a public good in that sense, with this launch of this OECD report. The third objective was to conduct sound empirical analysis on the effects of migration on regional development. And that meant going beyond what has been the focus of most work on at the regional level so far, namely employment outcomes of migrants, and providing novel evidence that has so far been missing on the links between migration and different dimensions of regional development. The report, and I invite you, of course, to consult it and read it in detail, focuses on 4 major topics. The first one is the subnational geography of migration in OECD countries, answering questions of where migrants live and what type of regions that migration has been increasing more than elsewhere, and so on. Second topic is the labor market integration of migrants across OECD regions. The third topic was it's a topical issue that arose during the pandemic. Precisely, we examined the implications of COVID-19 for migrants in OECD regions and cities, and also scrutinized the role of migrants as key workers in essential services in OECD regions and cities. Finally, the report examines how migration can affect various dimensions of regional economic development, focusing on 4 different areas of regional development: regional income, regions international trade, local innovation, and regional labor markets. In the interest of time, we have to be brief, but we would like to share a few of our key findings. The first one might be strikingly obvious, but has so far been neglected often. It is the fact that geography and geographic detail really matters. And you see this when analyzing migration. Detailed geographic information is essential. These maps offer, the richness, illustrate the richness of the new OECD database and show the impressive variation of the migrant population within OECD countries and sometimes even within OECD regions. But this point becomes even more salient with the illustration of an example such as the Netherlands. As you can see here, we focus on one country and contrast data based on large regions, on tier 2 regions, with data on smaller geographical areas, such as municipalities in this case. A closer look at such granular data in OECD countries shows that sometimes even regional averages hide large differences across communities in terms of migration, in terms of the share of migrants, where migrants live and where migration has been increasing. Additionally, we need to really emphasize again that local conditions are important because they can shape the contribution of migrants to local economies and the labor market integration. And therefore, granular data on migrants, on migration, on the labor market outcome, and so on is crucial for effective policy. Using the new data set, we can produce statistics for different geographies, for example, small regions, which in turn can be classified according to their proximity to larger or to metropolitan areas. In doing this, we see that compared to the native-born population, migrants tend to be much more concentrated in metropolitan regions. That is, regions with a metropolitan area of more than 250,000 inhabitants. In fact, more than 80% of migrants live in such metropolitan regions compared to around 70% of the native-born population. Looking at recent changes where this population share of migrants has increased the most, we observe that migration has increased faster in OECD capital regions, which continue to exhibit a strong attraction to migrants, as well as in regions with strong labor markets, where employment rates have been growing the fastest and where unemployment has been decreasing the most. If we look at the labor market, we see that across the OECD, the integration of migrants has significantly improved in recent years. The gap between migrants and natives in regional labor markets has been narrowing in the vast majority of OECD regions. Crucially, we also document that migrants fill important labor shortages or fill out important roles in positions of labor shortages, often in highly relevant jobs such as essential occupations, as earlier referred to, key workers. On average, migrants account for 40% of key workers in European regions. And migrants also play a particularly important role in the healthcare system in many OECD countries, especially in our cities. Almost a quarter of medical doctors and a fifth of nurses in cities are migrants, are foreign-born individuals. In this report, we also document that migrants, as of 2019, actually tend to be on average more high-skilled than the native-born population in most regions. Nonetheless, they often work in jobs below their qualification levels, and this is particularly the case in cities, in larger cities and larger metropolitan regions. Despite the improvement in the labor market, migrants, especially in European regions, still lag behind the native-born when it comes to employment outcomes or labor market outcomes. This is particularly the case in many regions of Western and Northern Europe, as illustrated in this map on the right-hand side. The report itself highlights 3 key areas where actions could be taken to improve migrant integration in regional labor markets. First, European regions often face difficulties in supporting non-EU migrants into employment. While in many European regions, EU migrants even outperform the native-born population in terms of employment, non-EU migrants significantly lag behind in the labor market, almost everywhere, with the exception of a few regions in Eastern Europe or some regions in Southern Italy. The second area is gender equality in the labor market. Across the board, we see that low female labor force participation of migrants remains a challenge, and in fact drives large gaps across regions between natives and migrants in terms of employment. While the employment rate of male migrants and natives is similar in most regions, differences for women are often substantial. Female migrants are on average 17 percentage points less likely to be in employment than male migrants, and their employment rate is also around 8 percentage points below that of native-born women. The third area is the fact that regions often struggle to make full use of the potential of talents and skills of migrants in their economies. Even though migrants often provide valuable skills, their skills are not often fully used, meaning migrants often tend to work in occupations that do not correspond or fully utilize their skills and their qualifications. Based on rigorous econometric evidence, the report also examines how regions can benefit from migration not only as a vital source of labor, especially in key sectors with significant shortages, but also in several other dimensions of regional economic development. Migration can also support regional economic growth, can bring new ideas to regions, fostering thus local innovation, and it can help help regions establish new trade links. This report shows that migration can be an important mechanism to boost regional GDP per capita. Regions that experience an increase in the share of migrants recorded a larger rise in income per capita across the OECD. In Europe, migration has contributed to regional economic convergence, as poorer regions that experience migration recorded larger gains in income per capita than richer regions. On average, a 10% increase in the migrant share is associated with a 0.15% higher regional GDP per capita. But this effect is almost twice as high for the poorest quartile for the quartile of regions with the lowest GDP per capita in Europe. Migrants can also contribute to regions' internationalization and innovation. By bringing new ideas to their host regions, migrants help foster local innovations, and we document this by examining patenting activity and showing that local areas that experienced a larger rise in the population share of migrants also recorded a larger increase in patenting activity per capita. Furthermore, migrants help the host regions establish new trade networks, especially with their countries of origin, and thus support regions' internationalization via exports and imports. On average, a 10% increase in the number of migrants equates to a 1.2% increase in a region's export and a 2.5% increase in imports. This is particularly pronounced for trade with places outside the European Union, including emerging markets, where the positive effects of migration are even larger, where the informal networks seem to play a more important role. Our analysis, our report also highlights that despite these benefits, challenges remain. In particular, the fact that these benefits are not shared equally across all places and people. Some poor regions struggle to integrate migrants economically. Regions with more highly educated migrants record larger increases in international trade than regions with lower educated migrants. Already more innovative areas appear to benefit the most from migration with respect to innovation. And additionally, migration can also give rise to short-term adjustment costs in the labor market. Short-term growth in the natives' employment rates is slowed in European regions with a larger increase in labor force due to migration, mainly affecting lower educated workers and lower income regions. In contrast, regions with a high level of GDP, richer or more affluent, more prosperous regions manage to integrate new workers, new migrants, much faster, and which resulted in no effect on native workers in the labor force. But it's crucial to emphasize that we also document as labor markets just adjust over time, these short-term effects, short-term costs disappear. Pardon. Well, taking into account these findings, the report lays out a number of targeted policies that can help spread migration's benefits across regions and all people across OECD regions. But in the interest of time, I like to refer you to the report, where you can find many more details as well as findings on the links between migration and regional development. Instead, I suggest that we, on this note, move to the first panel discussion, where we can zoom in on some of the effect of some of the effective examples of regional policies, of place-based policies that can support migrant integration and can support regions in fully utilizing the skills of migrants for their economy. So on this note, I'd like to conclude and pass the floor to my colleague, Paolo Veneri, who will head our first panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Lucas, for the presentation. Now, let me tell the audience that I'm honored to chair this first panel discussion. We have actually today about 40 minutes to discuss with 4 panelists some of the questions and some of the main issues that are treated in the report. We have 4 speakers, but before naming them, let me tell you that the idea is to have a dynamic discussion. So anyone from the audience who is interested and would like to make a question, I invite them to put a question in the chat, and then we will try to pick them towards the end of the round table. Let's see, because we will have a short intervention by the panelists, a couple of short interventions. So going to the speakers, we have in alphabetical order Megan Benton, who's Director of International Research at the Migration Policy Institute, London. We have Louis Dijkstra, who's Head of the Economic Analysis Sector in the Director General for the Regional and Urban Policy in the European Commission. We have Chagla Rusden, who's Lead Economist at the World Bank, and Natalia Popova, who's Labor Economist at the International Labour Organization, in particular Labour Migration branch. So welcome all the speakers. Very happy that you are here. So I would say that we organized this discussion around the 2 main pillars that Lucas just mentioned in his presentation. I would say one pillar is about data evidence. So I mean, statistical indicators, evidence at the subnational level of migration, its importance, opportunities, challenges that we have in advancing on this front, contribution of the report, but also what's the agenda for ahead. And then the second pillar would be more about the understanding how migration is linked to regional development, which are the mechanisms, and Lucas already explained some of the main mechanisms on which the report sheds some light. So without being too long, I would start then with the first question on data. Therefore, I would start with Louis, given his specific expertise with data. And Louis, your work relies on high-quality regional data, like also I think the OECD work. What are the main challenges that you see in gathering harmonized cross-country data? Because I mean, both our organizations, OECD and the European Commission, work across countries, and so the comparability is really a priority. So what role can institutions play in facilitating the generation of such data sets? Thanks.
Thank you, Paolo. Really good question, and it is a big challenge. Often we can find a richer data set or a broader data set at the national level for specific countries, but never for our 27 member states at the same time. I think international organizations like ours can really lead the way in two different ways. First of all, highlighting the importance to get granular data and spatial data. And I really want to thank you and the team that put together this report. I really think it highlights how much more we can do when we have better data at a high spatial resolution. And the other thing, of course, is to set standards, agree on how to collect this data, right? Right now, we already, some data is becoming standard. It's quite easy to get country of birth. Then, do we want to group country of birth? Do we want to add year of entry, for example? How far can we go? Some countries are considering also country of birth of parents. Is this something that we want to add? So I think there's a whole debate there, but let me just share one major innovation, which I think is going to be terribly exciting. We will get a population grid at the 1 kilometer level. So cells of 1 by 1 kilometer. We will not just get total population, we'll get population by age and sex and by country of birth. And then all of a sudden, you can do so much more spatial analysis about where they cluster, not just the fact that they cluster in a large city, but where in that city. Is it downtown? Is it in the burbs? Is it in the north? Is it in a rich area? Is it in a poor area? You can do so much more. Is it in an accessible area? So I really think that's important. So the three things is highlight the importance, set the standards, and then lead the way in doing analysis with these new harmonized data sets.
Thanks, Luis. It's really exciting to know how granular the European Commission can go now for many topics, and producing grids. It's very exciting for also the research community to have such data available. So let me follow up with Chaglar. Chaglar, you contributed to the development also of other OECD database at the national level of immigrants. And you use that in your research. So what do you think are the challenges, let's say, or the problems in collecting data on migration, and what was the added value of going regional in the sense for this data? Mm-hmm. Well, and also how the World Bank then overcome this disaster. Thanks.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you all for inviting me to speak here. When Jem sent me the program, I'm in the policymakers group. So in my mind, policymakers are the retired World Bank people who, they're trying to stay relevant. But now just to add, I don't know if I'm a policymaker per se, because I don't make policy, and I don't know if policymakers listen to me per se. But let me talk about the brief things you asked, and especially how it's related to data and how it is related to overall policy agenda. Migration is about economic geography. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And because of the way data are collected, we only look at the national level. But that is hiding important details in the following way. I'll give you two really simple examples, and you'll see immediately where I'm heading at. Standard labor economic theory predicts that there'll be a negative impact on wages of the natives, right? Because you're expanding labor supply. But what happens when you have a migration flow to a region, the natives adjust. They change sectors, they move geographically, right? And this is not such a bad thing. That's how the benefits of migration dissipate and spread around the country, around the destination country, right? That's the famous Miami example that everybody has been working on for the last 25, 30 years. Okay, so that's why in the empirics, we don't find a negative labor market impact. But people, the migrants, are geographically located because of the diaspora externalities. Okay, so when the arrival of the migrants in a specific geographic area, and your data shows they are geographically concentrated, economic benefits, economic impacts dissipate, benefits increase rapidly, and the costs dissipate because of mobility of the natives. But because the immigrants stay geographically concentrated, the social impacts stay concentrated. And hence, we end up where we are, right? The big tension between the social impacts and the economic impacts of migration. And hence, the rapid or the rabid opposition to migration in the policy and the public circles. Now, I'm giving you as an example where the data constraints come in. So the next World Development Report is on migration at the World Bank, and that's a big milestone because the World Bank stayed out of this because it was too much politics. And I'm one of the co-directors, and one of the themes we're pushing, hopefully, is this complicated interaction between the economic and the social impacts of migration. And the data sets and all of this complex interaction between social and economic impacts operate at the local level, right? Especially in high-income democracies, because that's how it works. The local senator or the congressman or the representative, they're looking at their only localized impacts. And the negative impacts tend to be more concentrated, and the positive impacts spread as a result of this whole process. So the data sets and the analysis we're looking at need to take this into account. It is not only enough, it is a huge step and valuable step to collect localized labor market data, but we need to actually merge and analyze it together with all the other data, whether if it's housing or it is congestion at the schools and public services or or the media and all of those things and traffic, because they are all localized. The way the policies are made in the OECD countries, it is a distorted, the keyword is here, distorted weighted average of the local impacts, because that's how the politics operate. So I am grateful the OECD is doing this, but the next step, I think, as policymakers, now that I'm old enough, that I'm being put into that category, that we start basically looking at these effects in a joint and holistic way, right? Not just economics. We don't just look at our labor economics hat and ignore all the other stuff and vice versa, because look at it this way. We're talking about Ukraine and it's all about humanitarian issues. Then we look at labor migration, it's all about economics, but it's not true. People are complex. They have multiple attributes. Everything enters the picture simultaneously, and the public and the politicians, public and the politicians know this better than us as the researchers and the policymakers. So my suggestion for going forward is collecting and integrating more data sets. And the second thing, this is not your fault. This is where your paycheck comes from. You're looking at OECD countries, right? That's natural. I'm not talking about, I'm not saying look at non-OECD destinations. The same economic geography of concentration of migration happens in the origin countries, right? If you look at Mexico's or Turkey's or this part of the world, migrants, again, because of the diaspora externalities, come from specific regions. What is the impact there? So again, we have the social impacts, transmission of cultural norms, social norms, gender norms, how they operate. There's fantastic papers coming out looking at comparing Egyptian migration to the Gulf versus to the West, right? So we should be able to, maybe OECD doesn't do it, I'm putting it out there to the policymakers and researchers and data collectors, we should be doing it at the same way in the origin countries. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Çağlar. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting comment on this, on why it is important as subnational dimension, this interaction between social and economic. It's very aspects are it's very interesting, and it's actually something on which we will definitely continue working, because we made lots of effort to produce this data, but then, as you suggest, I mean, we have to integrate with other indicators, other dimension of economic, society, etc. And on this, let me mention that the data that Lucas and Nadim mentioned at the beginning that we produced through this report will be published in our subnational databases, which are integrated databases, including a number of dimensions of including demography, economic, environment, housing, etc. So I think there is plenty of opportunity for the research community also to use this data, and I hope we'll continue the discussion very soon based on even new evidence. So let me continue with Megan now. Megan, now I guess you have been working, I think, with subnational government, and could you highlight a little bit of what do you think are the benefits also for the subnational dimensions, including having the data as subnational dimensions, and what are the most important policy responses that can be done at the local level to reap the benefits of migration? Thanks.
Thank you. And Chaglar is uncomfortable with our session being framed as policymakers. I also wouldn't put myself in that bracket, but I was kind of honored to be in it rather than in any way offended. And so, yeah, I thought I would spend a bit of time living up to the name and thinking about some policy takeaways. Firstly, this is such a rich report, and thank you for putting it out. You know, we often, as other speakers have said, look at immigration data in the aggregate and we don't understand the granular specificities and the distributional effects. So it's really significant and useful for us in our work. You know, some of the most interesting policy takeaways for me, I mean, the fact that large metropolitan areas really absorb the lion's share of immigrants is not new, but it's nice to have it set out so clearly. This point about employment gaps being larger between foreign and native born outside of metropolitan regions, also not a surprise, but very interesting, especially the gender dimension there. I was really struck by the point that the innovation dividends of immigration seem to be unevenly spread. I think the report brings that out really clearly. What I was really struck by an absence perhaps in the report was a discussion of the demographics of different regions and the fact that different regions are a really different context when it comes to how rapidly they're aging. So some really have the most to gain from immigration from a demographic context. So I just wanted to pull out three implications, I think, for addressing that demographic context and designing place-based policy responses. The first is this question of whether or not you can build immigration policies that get immigrants to go to particular areas. You know, there's been a lot of interest in place-based immigration policies in recent years, especially in Canada and Australia, for instance. There's also lots of soft policies like city-level branding exercises that have been tried across the OECD, but they're so difficult to get work. You know, it's hard to get immigrants from moving on from these regions, and that might be success. You know, many economists question the logic of channeling people to low productivity areas and interfering with market forces, including this desire that comes through in the report of new immigrants to follow jobs and networks. And it's not necessarily the case that by sending people, encouraging people to a particular area, they'll be able to fill local labor shortages. You know, Nadine started with this question for Ukrainian refugees. The question there might be, do we want localities to share the burdens and the benefits, or are we happy for many to go to the cities where they have the largest diaspora and metropolitan regions? And I think all of this points to the importance of integration policies, which is my second point. You know, the report, as I said, points to larger gaps. One reason for this is very obvious. High educated immigrants go to cities. Refugee dispersal policies means that it's vulnerable groups who are allocated to rural areas where there's more housing, but maybe less jobs. I think this points to the need for more innovative partnerships at the local level, so involving local employers more in skills building and on-the-job training, connecting up childcare and training, having a gender lens to these discussions. But a major challenge is job creation. Stimulating entrepreneurship very rarely happens in small and rural communities and in regions away from metropolitan centers because they just lack the economies of scale. They can't support incubators and training. So I think a discussion might be, how do you adapt what works in an urban context to different contexts, particularly when it comes to entrepreneurship? And if I just have one half a minute, I think we need to talk about social cohesion and public trust when it comes to getting regions to reap the benefits of immigration. You know, Chaglar talked about the social concentration of immigration, but many of the places that are experiencing the greatest demographic and economic decline are also places that have the highest anxiety about immigration, even though they're not the ones who have the most immigrants. You know, in Germany, the rise of the AfD is strongest in regions that are aging most rapidly. In England, regions that voted for Brexit are the ones that are still battered by the death of mining and major industry in the 80s. So I think you need these communities to be welcoming if you want to reap the benefits of immigration. And you also want people to want to stay there and feel welcome. So I think it's interesting. I think we can see declining regions as kind of a microcosm of one of the big challenges facing advanced economies, which is how do you harness immigration to mitigate population aging amid public skepticism and a potential backlash? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan. So we suggest that to relabel our session to let's say policy panel, not panels of policymakers. Maybe it would be more correct. And thanks for your observation, actually, including the one on everything, the mentioning some of the city-specific initiative or some ideas like involving local employers for skilling people. These are, I think, are all ideas that actually are very, very useful and come from your experience. So very welcome this discussion. Now, let me also make a question to Natalia from ILO. Natalia, you work in ILO, so where, and I guess you are also working a lot with the data on migration. So where do you think we need more evidence? Do you have any priority that you think for which it's more important to produce evidence and to produce data to answer all these policy questions?
Thank you very much and good afternoon. Well, I mean, the ILO focus on labor migration and labor migration statistics. I think there are very many aspects of labor migration where we need more data and information. Of course, what we are seeing in the OECD report, I mean, it's really fantastic in terms of how detailed information we can get when it comes to labor market outcomes for migrant workers, and then looking at different groups of migrant workers with different skill levels. And indeed, I mean, this plethora of information could be very important for designing both labor market integration policies, but also strengthening social integration. In terms of areas where we need more information, when it comes to labor migration, definitely we need to know more about the working conditions of migrant workers in terms of benefits, in terms of wages, also in terms of occupational related injuries, for example, is an area where there is very limited information. Another area where we lack information is about temporary migration and return. And actually here I'm thinking how your data sets could inform other data sets that we have. So actually we could link information from destination and then origin countries. Another area which I think deserves further attention is the issue of irregular versus regular migration, because then we know that labor market outcomes to a great extent are conditioned by migratory status. And perhaps the last area that I would mention, again, when I'm thinking of the report that you're just presenting, is the issue of diaspora and how diaspora, where it is located, but also, let's say, issues related to what extent diaspora could contribute to development outcomes in their countries of origin. So I think these are some of the areas, they're not exclusive, but let's say some main areas where further statistical information could be very helpful. And I fully agree with the colleague from the World Bank who said that the exercise that you have carried out in OECD countries, it would be very interesting if it is applied also to other regions and in particular origin countries. But of course, there could be also a number of challenges when it comes to data availability. Yeah, thank you. I'll stop here. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Yes, I agree. I mean, of course, also on this last point, developing countries are not very not the object, let's say, of this report, but this topic for migration is very important. I see Luis raise his hand, please.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on one of the many interesting things that Megan raised. I want to think a little bit about, say, the distribution of the foreign-born across a territory. One of the things we clearly see, for example, in the EU, is that the people born outside the EU are much more concentrated. First of all, they're much more concentrated in cities, and second of all, they're much more concentrated in Western European countries than Eastern European countries. And if you compare that to people born inside the EU, but living in a different member state, you don't see that concentration effect so much. They're not as concentrated in cities. They're more likely to live in rural areas and towns and suburbs. And for me, what that really kind of highlights is also what I would call the benefit of one of the freedoms that the union guarantees, right? The freedom of movement. It means that if you want to work somewhere and you find a job, you stay. If you find a better job somewhere else, or you lose your job and you want to go somewhere else, you can move, right? And it's very easy to move to a different member state. So you're less confined to a specific location. And if you want to retire somewhere else, again, you can move, right? And so fundamentally, working for an organization that wants to guarantee that freedom of movement, I have some issues with this idea that we would benefit from trying to spread foreign-born across the territory. If they find better opportunities, and don't forget, those born outside the EU have significantly lower employment rates. The idea that we would benefit both the migrants and the host communities by changing their spatial distribution, I think there's a pretty heavy burden of evidence to show that this would actually be beneficial for all parties concerned. What I found very interesting in your work is particularly the gender dimension, right? One of the big reasons that the foreign-born, non-EU born have lower employment rates is because the women have lower employment rates. So if we really want to facilitate that economic type of integration, I don't think we should farm them out to the rural areas, but provide them with the language and training skills that they need to be successful on the labor market, and actually having them close to their diaspora, their people who share maybe a language, a cuisine, a culture, a religion, can be very beneficial and very positive. So I would not see the spatial concentration as an issue. I would actually think take it as a given, and then work with that to see how we can use that to foster their economic integration even more. But the big benefit of that spatial data that you're collecting is that we really can see where these groups are concentrated and where they are living, and how they are prospering or not, and how we can facilitate that.
Luis, if I can just make you a follow-up question, very, very short, that you already tackled what I wanted to ask you. But do you think that this higher concentration of migrants in cities, and also the fact that, as the report shows, the regions on average that have larger share of migration also experience higher income growth? So do you think that this migration can let's say, increase the regional disparity, the regional economic disparity, and instead it's a mechanism that to re-equilibrate and to push the convergence, like also the report shows?
It's a very good question, and I think the report is correct in the sense that over time, migrants contribute to the economies of the places that they are living in, and they do that in a variety of channels. But I don't necessarily think these are channels that can be necessarily replicated everywhere, right? So what is the alternative scenario? The alternative scenario is not that we see more foreign-born in rural areas and that they become more innovative and more export-oriented. The real alternative is really that we see fewer foreign-born And I find that not a very attractive way of trying to avoid income disparities or territorial disparities within a country or within our union. One other thing I would highlight too is we've collected data together with Gallup on whether a place is a good, whether your area is a good place to live for migrants. And we find very different results. And in many places, people are fairly honest and they say like, no, if I were born somewhere else, I wouldn't want to live in my area. And if that country is poor, more people say no. And if that's a rural area, even more people say no. So it's really, you know, there's both positive and negative reasons why the foreign-born concentrate in cities. The positive is the community, the proximity to people who know what they've been through and who know their country of origin. But the negative ones are also present in cities, and they might still not feel very welcome in cities, but they also have realized that the situation might be considerably worse elsewhere in the country. So if we want to see a broader acceptance of migrants, that's what we need to work on, and not just in cities, but also, and maybe especially in rural areas, because one of the previous speakers mentioned it already, you know, the ones that are aging and shrinking the most rapidly also are the most terrified of the foreign-born, especially if they look and talk different. And so I don't see that as a solution unless we can convince them that this is a positive and a change to embrace rather than to resist and to fear.
Thanks, Luis, for this additional thoughts. Very, very useful. And I see that maybe Chala want to react. He raised his hand, please.
Yeah, we're talking about old people, and it's, you know, it's a fact of life in the OECD, right? It's the choices our parents and we are making about our careers and our lives. It is what it is. One thing I want to emphasize is the following. I think one mistake policymakers make, and we are or politicians make, policymakers make, is the following. The distribution of migrants across geography is an outcome. It is responding to the underlying economic forces, right? It is not something we want to necessarily as policymakers manipulate. On the contrary, I mean, EU is a fascinating experience based on the free market idea. Let the markets operate, right? So what the policymakers need to do is to reduce the mobility barriers for the migrants as well as the natives and all these distortions so that the people make the optimal choices, again, whether if they're migrants or natives, right? So I think we need to, like, we're putting, in some ways, policymakers putting the cart in front of the horse and looking at, oh, this is as if where we need to get the migrants to go, or this is what we need to people. No, we need to, again, the critical thing is remove all these distortions in the labor markets, the education markets, the pensions, social welfare programs that prohibit the mobility of people, and then let them decide what's optimal. And in the process, I'm sorry to say, certain regions are going to die, certain companies are going to die, certain industries are going to die, the same way other ones are going to flourish. That's, I mean, we don't have millions of horses around anymore, right? And that's for a good reason. And we're going to be out of gasoline engines, hopefully pretty soon. And it's an example. This is a process. And saying the migrants do this, migrants do that. No, I mean, migrants contribute, but migrants are people who are responding to incentives. So the issue is setting the incentives, and especially the cost structures, right? And let them figure out the benefits and optimize along that dimension.
Thank you, Chala. Then I'll give the floor to Megan, who also wants to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to those 2 points from Luis and Chagla. I think there's a difference between forced spatial dispersal, so manipulating the economic conditions, and creating the conditions for all regions to reap the benefits of immigration, which I think means thinking about the integration infrastructure and connecting up economic development and thinking about migration, which just doesn't really happen right now. You know, there isn't very much of that whole of government approach when it comes to regions. And then, you know, we haven't really talked about the issue of refugee dispersal, but, you know, it is a different question how you create opportunities for refugees who are sent to particular areas where there aren't very many opportunities. I was really excited to see the section on remote work in this report. Remote work, immigrants are underrepresented in remote work. They're not generally in the kind of jobs that are like remotable, but is there an opportunity there for some kind of both providing people who are unable to get traditional jobs in those places with remote work, or thinking about how remote work has led to a sort of little bit of revival of some mid-sized cities, and what's the kind of supporting economy that looks like that might create job opportunities. But yeah, I do think we don't really want to just say that when it comes to refugees, they're just kind of going to move on after a certain period of time, or they're essentially stuck in a dying region. You know, we want to be creating the conditions for them to thrive, even in those places, rather than just being committed to the idea that they move on. And there are examples of where refugee arrivals with the right investments and partnerships and so on have kind of turned around some sort of rural cities in the Midwest. And, you know, bringing in people and local money can kind of make services more viable, for instance, and that can benefit the local community too. So that's what I meant, really, just to defend my position.
Thanks, Megan, also for this reference on reference to refugees, which is of course extremely important nowadays to think about. Lewis.
Just a quick point to Chaglar. I enjoyed your horses metaphor, but I would argue that regions aren't like horses. Very few of them die, right? I think this is a question of scale, and I have a big disagreement with Indermit Gill on that front. I think we have ghost villages in Europe, and there are more villages that will probably shrink and disappear in the future. But our regions are pretty big. You know, I don't see any regions with a couple of million people in them about to disappear during my lifetime. And so even though we have population change, it is very slow, and we don't need massive migration to save our regions from dying out like the horses have done in our transport systems. On the refugee point, and on Megan's broader point about forced and creating the opportunities for migrants to thrive everywhere, I couldn't agree more. It is not about pushing them to go live somewhere else, but offering them the opportunity that they could also live somewhere else and do well. On that front, I think, you know, especially in light of what's happening in Ukraine, we need to be very clear that migrants are very different from refugees. You know, refugees come because they're scared and because they might get killed, and they might want to go back as soon as things become safe, if they become safe. Refugees don't necessarily have the right to work as long as they're, you know, paperwork is being processed, and unfortunately that can take a very long time. So we should really be very clear that, you know, somebody who's just arrived from a war-torn country is very different from somebody who's been living in a country for 10 years, has a job, as an, you know, or went to school there, or etc. And I think that the policies you have around both are quite distinct. There are a number of countries who have realized that hosting refugees in the countryside where housing is cheap and plentiful might be a good money saving mechanism, but I'm not sure whether this is, I don't know whether this is relevant for a discussion on migrants, and I don't even know if this is the best option for refugees, quite honestly. Personally, it's not the union to have an opinion on this front, but I definitely think, you know, allow them to work as soon as they arrive. It's much better for everybody, but that's my private opinion.
Thank you, Luis. Now we have Natalia who raises her hands, please.
Yeah, I mean, I just have a quick comment. I mean, this is, I think, an aspect that we have not really discussed a lot. I mean, the quality of employment that migrant workers get and their access to formal jobs as opposed to working in the informal economy. So, I mean, I think your report definitely is very interesting in terms of giving us information about the spatial distribution and looking at migrant workers by skill levels. And I think, I mean, we see, as this is confirmed also by other studies and literature on the subject, that high-skilled migrant workers, I mean, they do tend to have better labor outcomes. They live in richer communities. They're concentrated in cities where there are more services, and so on and so forth. So then my question is about low and medium skilled migrant workers, and especially the low skilled one, which are also those who tend to be more vulnerable on the labor market. Also, I mean, we know there are fewer possibilities for them to migrate through regular channels. So there's two new data sets that you have, and I'm always thinking of how they could be integrated also with other data sets that we have at the ILO, looking at other parts of the world. I mean, how we could also address the issue of access to quality employment, being in urban setting or in a rural setting for migrant workers. Yeah, I'm just putting it on the table also for the other panelists. Over to you, Paolo.
Thank you, Natalia. Then I go over for
Sorry, I just want to clarify something. I mean, I think what this report is showing, and now Giovanni is here, it's all about the unit of measurements, right? Economic geography that's what it's teaching us. Are you looking at the zip code? Are you looking at the town or the neighborhood? Are you looking at the region or the country? Right? And it's the same thing in economics. Like when I give the horse example, I'm talking about the horse carriages. I'm not talking about transportation industry, right? And it's the same thing in a region. A neighborhood might die, that doesn't mean the city dies. A village might die, that doesn't mean the region is dying or a country is dying, right? So the emphasis I'm trying to make, there's so much to learn and understand when you actually do more and more finer analysis. And that's what this report is heading us, because looking at a country as a uniform entity is not the right way to go, because both the economic impacts and the social impacts and their really complex interactions are happening at the local level, even at the neighborhood level. So this is where we need to go. And again, I want to allow the report management and the authors is basically taking the steps in that direction.
If I can just jump in, Paolo, just for a brief second, I fully agree with Chaglar, and I want to share the academic term for this problem. The academic term for this is methodological nationalism. It's assuming that analyzing everything through the prism of a nation state is logical and sensical, and often it is wrong. And especially when it comes to migration, which is so spatially concentrated, forgetting about the subnational dimension is forgetting about the most important dimension. So yes, we should avoid methodological nationalism.
This is definitely something we are doing with this report. So thanks. Now, I have a couple of questions also in the chat, since we are going towards the end. Maybe some of the speakers can intervene on this. One by James, that has been partially already touched in the discussion, is what's the role of regions and local economies to also promote the integration of refugees? And the second question is about the fiscal impact of low-skilled migration on regional and national government. So does anybody want to pick one of those two questions?
I can maybe take the second one. Can't fully capture the fiscal impact, but I would argue that migration by skill level follows different spatial patterns. And the classic example is picking fruits and vegetables. It's a typically low skill job, which the UK is now noticing that their native population isn't particularly interested in filling that job. And also during COVID times, you know, all of a sudden, quite a few farmers were struggling to get also their seasonal workers, the type of work that's not very well captured by official statistics because they might not be resident there for an entire year. So, you know, low skill migration is different, both from a spatial perspective, but also from a temporal perspective. And of course, you know, you have a lot of famous examples, at least within the EU, of construction workers and plumbers temporarily or more permanently moving to a different part of the union because the wages are substantially higher. And again, you know, their commitments to staying there long term is unclear. It may differ. Whereas, you know, it might be that the goal of a low-skilled migrant would be to save as much money as possible and to avoid spending as money in the country they're in, whereas a high-skilled worker is more likely to move to the capital, which are a larger city, and his or her question may be, well, what country do I go next, as opposed to, can I go home ASAP? So I do think the skill component has a big impact on migration. The benefit, of course, of also low-skilled migration is that it's often very difficult to fill those jobs quickly without migration, and we are confronted with that, with lots of labor shortages in many different sectors. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Luis, very much. So I see 2 hands raised. I would ask you, since we are going towards the end, just to keep it very short, if possible. Megan, please.
Yeah, just to take the first question on what works for labour market integration for refugees and the role of regions. So I think most of the evidence suggests that it's extremely context specific, and it also depends how you define success. So is it self-sufficiency or is it quality of work, as Natalia pointed to? In countries like the US, refugees have had really good employment outcomes by being encouraged into work by, no longer receiving benefits after a certain period of time. But, at what cost? Has this been overwhelmingly low skilled work? Meanwhile, in places like Germany with, knowledge economies and higher barriers to entering the labour market and the need for greater language proficiency, they've focused on much more intensive investments in labour market integration at the offset, and intensive language courses, which tend to work sequentially and thus really delay access to the labour market, but potentially lead to more sustainable outcomes. So that's the long way of saying it's complicated. I think for Ukrainians, it's a really interesting question what we can draw from these lessons, because they are under, in the EU, for instance, temporary protection status. They may want to return home. Is there a case for supporting them into work as soon as possible? The Ukrainians have really strong employment outcomes, existing Ukrainians in the EU. And can we think about opportunities for integration investments from within the work? So greater use of digitization, on-the-job language training, but really, enabling people to work as soon as possible, rather than doing that kind of long-standing investments in language training that tend to be quite high on the opportunity cost.
Thanks, Megan. Now, Natalia, you have the last intervention.
Yeah, also to address the first question concerning integration of refugees, I mean, the work at the local and regional level is indeed very important, and also working with the hosting communities in order to avoid any tensions, and also working with the local employers and social partners more generally, in order to make sure that indeed labour market integration takes place smoothly. But I think it's equally important also to collaborate with the national authorities. Is a 2-track approach, because of course, it's country by country basis, but access to the labor market is not always automatic for refugees. So actually making sure that they can have formal access to the labor market is very important, and usually this takes place at national level. So both nationally and regionally and locally. I mean, these are really complementary levels that we need to take into account when we design policies for that. Yeah, over to you.
Thanks, Natalia, and thanks everybody for this very enriching discussion. Super interesting. I think we could continue for much longer. Let me just say 3 things that I mean, it's difficult to summarize. I don't want to summarize the content, of course, of this session. just let me say three very simple things. I think that migration is really an economic geography issue, so it's important really that granular data then is valuable, as also Chagra has very deeply highlighted. Also spreading the benefits of migration. In order to do that, it's important to create the conditions and also let people move and the regional labor market to work correctly, to adjust. And going forward, I'm really looking forward to continue working on this and to assess especially the economic and social dimension of migration at the local level, which is essential for understanding really the link to migration and regional development. And with this, I stop here. I thank all the panelists again. And Lucas, back to you.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, Paolo, and especially thank you very much to our fantastic speakers, Megan, Natalia, Chagla, and Louis, for this very insightful and lively debate, I must say, which certainly also gave us food for thought for future work on areas where we need to do more. So I keep it brief. I'll pass it on to Jem for a second panel, and again, looking forward to a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
So thank you, Lucas. So my name is Jem Özgüzel. I'm an economist at the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities, and I'm also one of the authors of this report. So now we're moving on to the next roundtable, which has a bit more academic focus. So as you may know, in the past 2 decades, academic research has expanded our knowledge on the local effects of migration significantly. However, there are still many missing pieces in our understanding of this complex phenomenon, and there are many empirical challenges that remain in the measurement of these local effects. So today we have the privilege and the pleasure to have a roundtable involving 4 amazing speakers who have been working on various dimensions of migration, and I'm sure it will be a great discussion. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers very briefly. Our first speaker is Christina Gatman, who is the head of Labor Market Division at Luxembourg Institute of Socioeconomic Research. Christina is a labor economist who has worked extensively on the role of human capital in the labor market, migration, and integration. Christina, welcome. Our second speaker is Giovanni Perry, who is a professor of economics at the University of California, Davis. Giovanni's research focuses on the impact of migration on the labor markets, productivity, political elections in the receiving countries, but also on the determinants of migration, international migration. Welcome, Giovanni. Our third speaker is Sari Pekela-Kerr, who's a senior research scientist at Wellesley College. Sari has worked on issues related to immigrant entrepreneurship, gender wage gap, local economic conditions that shape behavior of firms. Welcome. And our final speaker is Madeline Zavodi, who is a professor of economics at the University of North Carolina. Madeline has worked extensively on issues related to migration and their labor market integration, including the effect of migrants on business dynamics, job creation, and native wages. Welcome to you as well. So finally, I'd like to remind our audience to type their questions onto the chat, and we will ask them in the second half of our roundtable. So I will start with a first set of questions that are specific to speakers and their and relate to the years of extensive research that they have done on those topics. And then maybe in the second roundtable, the second part of roundtable, we can also answer some of the questions that were raised in the first roundtable, because I know that the speakers in this roundtable have also a lot to say on these topics. So let me start with Christina. Christina, so I know that you have been working for a very long time on trying to understand what human capital is and how general it is, and what matters for transferability of skills. And we know that migrants cannot fully transfer them because, I mean, the skills that they have acquired in their countries of origin, and they often work in jobs that are below their at least formal skills. We know that there are many reasons that drive these differences, this underutilization of their skills. It could be related to language, it could be related to degree recognition, etc. So as someone who's been reflecting a lot on these topics, if I were to ask you to name one or the most important factor in your mind that prevents migrants to put into use their skills, what would that be? And ideally, we know that institutional setups, these things are decided at the national level, but do you see any potential to address these issues at the local level?
So thank you for inviting me and for the opportunity. So of course, that's a tricky question, and I'm not sure there is a global answer to that. I don't think there is one golden bullet that we somehow can throw into the picture, because again, it will depend a lot on the particular country situation. But let me maybe pick out a couple that I think in Europe play an important role, and I work a lot in Germany, so I guess that's inspiring maybe the answer. So I think the whole question about how do we judge and value skills and competencies that people bring over up and beyond formal degrees is an important matter. So Germany for a long time had a very strict policy of like not recognizing degrees, but I think it even goes beyond that, because obviously, if you're trained, let's say, as an electrician in some country in sub-Saharan Africa, that might be a very different job than an electrician in Germany. So I think we need to think about how do we take the skills that people bring, but build on them rather than throwing them away and say you have to start from scratch. And how can we sort of build up the competencies to make them prosper in the destination countries? And I think for that, we need to work much more on training programs that are modular. So, have people think about, okay, so you have this and this and this skill already, but you're missing a certain component that is important. So let's build a training program that focuses on a particular competency that you're already, that you don't have yet. So I think these are crucial questions, and I think the opportunity we have now is that this whole shifting in the training landscape is already happening, because I think we have similar issues now facing the native population with the digital transition and the green transition. So I think a lot of these jobs will change profoundly in the next decade or even 2 decades. So in some sense, I think migrants coming with different skills and natives having skills that are no longer important, or they're missing certain skills because their job is changing, poses similar challenges. And I think that gives us also an opportunity to rethink how do we need training programs to respond, to be much more flexible, much more personalized towards certain individual skill profiles and developments in jobs. And I think that's going to be a big challenge. Quickly, 2 other points which I think are important, holding immigrants back. I think information is big. Access to information, finding information about opportunities, possibilities, bureaucratic barriers that people are not used to how to deal with agencies. I think that's a big one. And that's a big one, I think, in some European countries for sure. And I think the third one, I also think is relevant, and that's role models. And I think that's often true, especially for the second generation. And there is, I think, a particular regional dimension here also, because often what you see is that in migrant communities, you have some very successful members who could act as a role model. And what happens is that these people move out of this local area and disappear. And the people who stay back is sort of the people who are less successful or maybe not successful at all. And I think that kind of creates a negative a negative atmosphere in some sense. And I think the same is also true that the role models should also be pushed much further for the native population, because I think we also need to work on the perception of immigration. We already discussed that in the first panel, that often, people are scared, terrified, these people wanted our jobs, our money. But I think there is a substantial part of immigration that's very positive, and it is almost silent because there's no trouble associated with that. And so I think we also need to highlight more the positive stories and the positive impacts that immigration has to sort of work on this fear and this, sort of reluctance to accept immigrants. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Indeed, one of the other things, areas of work of CFE is local skill system. And there's been recently 2 reports on London and Berlin. And one of the recommendations in both reports was also on the importance of creating more flexible and modular training programs to fully utilize the skills in the region. So another, of course, one aspect of this report that was highlighted throughout is that we focus on regional level, but also try to bring evidence at that level, but also cross-country evidence. So Giovanni, you have worked extensively at regional, you have done so much work, cross-country work, but also regional work. But if I'm not mistaken, never both of them. And we see it in most of research as well. Evidence is either at the subnational level, but focusing on a single country, or cross-country, but at the national level. Why do you think this is the case? Is it because of data, identification? What is the driver? And secondly, what do you think we can learn from subnational studies with a cross-country format?
So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation, Cem, and it's a very great pleasure to be here. So first, let me start with a big compliment, and then with correcting you a little bit. The compliment is that this report is incredibly interesting and touches some aspects which are really important. This intersection of regional, local, in the cross-country analysis is, I think, fundamental. I did do some work which actually spans region across country, and this is because the European Union is the other kind of organism which has been collecting relatively homogenized data only for the country in the EU. And so we have been looking a little bit at the impact of immigrants across regions in Europe, and then analyzing sort of how they vary across country. But this is the topic, this is the question you ask, which is why there is so little work about in this dimension, and what is interesting in this dimension. So why there is little work? In most of the analysis of economists in which they look at immigration, really, they recognize that immigration is a regional, is a local issue. People look at variation across cities, across local labor market, across regions, because as we have said in the previous panel, there are such huge disparity in number of immigrants, in type of immigrant, that it doesn't make sense to focus too much only on the aggregate. So people look at this local and geographically granular level. But as you say, they are tied to the data that they have. And so they focus on country, and sometimes on big country too. Germany is a big country. The US is a big country with a lot of internal variation, and just focus on that. Very few people go and say, well, there are some interesting issues that can arise from analyzing the local integration, the local impact of immigrants, but looking also across country. And I think one very interesting thing that one can do is, as you do in part a little bit in the report, is to look at how sort of impact or integration of immigrants across the region depends on national institutional policy, but then has an heterogeneity, has a difference based on the local condition. So this heterogeneity analysis of the impact across the different institutions, which are national, and across the different local conditions, which are regional, I think is very interesting to gain a better understanding, but is rare. The other thing that I would say is that, as you know, academic economists are a little obsessed with just identification in their papers. So trying to find a variation of immigration which is quasi-experimental or which is exogenous, so that they can assess an average. And then naturally, when you go and assess an average effect, you tend to focus on this average, exactly as you say, rather than there are some studies that look at heterogeneity of this, but the first goal is to get an exact or a causal estimate of this average. And I think this sometimes makes people look at regional characteristics as noise, as confounder that we want to try to control for, rather than as condition that will change and modify our results. So this approach sometimes has generated a little bit this idea that we can use regional variation, we can try to generate this quasi-experimental variation, but it's a little dangerous then to say, oh, how does this work in poor region, in a rich region, because maybe these characteristics are correlated with unobservable and they dirty the result. Bottom line, I think that this is an incredibly interesting agenda, and it is very important to go sort of as local as possible, and also take advantage of the variation across countries in institution and policies, and across region in terms of conditions. I do hope that works like yours and the one of the European Union will continue to generate data, better data, in order to analyze this type of issues.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So one of the aspects of, you said integration and local characteristics, and one of the things that is also important about migrants is that they are also slightly different than native population, and they are actually part of this population, even within their regions, who are the most vulnerable ones, right? We know that when the business cycles affect migrants more than natives. And in this crisis as well, and as we discussed in the report, migrants, among also women and young workers, they were the ones who suffered the brunt of the crisis, and they were most exposed to these negative shocks, labor demand shock that we saw experienced during the pandemic. So Madeline, I know that you have worked a lot on this topic, on the vulnerability of these groups, but especially the migrants, especially across business cycles. So what I'd like to ask you is, do you see any local dimension to these vulnerabilities? Do you see that in your view, are there local factors that can exacerbate these vulnerabilities? And what can these factors be? Can they be? It could be related to local industrial structure, institutions. In your view, what makes migrants more vulnerable? What local factors make them more vulnerable?
Great. So before I answer those wonderful questions, let me first thank you all for including me from the University of North Florida here in this panel today. The presentation at the very beginning that gave an overview of the report was wonderful. And of course, it's such a rich report. There's no way to highlight everything within it. And one of the wonderful things within the report, among many others, is this discussion about the pandemic and its relationship with immigration and regional differences and regional development. So I certainly encourage people to go and read the report and learn about these cross-country differences and differences within countries. It's absolutely fascinating. So I'm in the United States, and of course, this is the area that I know best. And so it's very interesting to learn about what the differences are across countries. Within the United States in particular, some of the local factors that have made the pandemic, particularly in its early stages, most difficult for immigrants were, of course, differences in the jobs held, as some referred to, differences in industries and occupations and so on. And so the report does a very nice job of highlighting some of these differences in essential workers. And so one thing is that immigrants are disproportionately represented in healthcare. And of course, those doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers had tremendous exposure to COVID, which was a big problem, particularly before the vaccines, but also work in a lot of service jobs that can't be performed remotely. So they're not like us who can sit here in their nice offices or homes and just dial into work remotely. Instead, they had to be out working, interacting with the public in order to get a paycheck. And so as a result, in a lot of communities, immigrants disproportionately bore the brunt of COVID because of the jobs that they held. But even deeper than that, at the local level, I think that overcrowded housing was a particular factor, at least in some parts of the United States. Southern California is perhaps the best exemplar of this. And a lot of this is related to high housing costs, so that you have families crowded in into multifamily housing that isn't truly supposed to be multifamily housing, so that you have houses or apartments that contain many families within them. And this is in large part due to local land regulations and NIMBYism, not in my backyard, where people just don't want to have lots of dense development in these areas. And that's something that really can only be solved ultimately at the local level. Another key thing is, at least in the United States, lack of access to health insurance. And this is a particular problem for the undocumented population, which is also much more likely to have had to go into work during the pandemic and be essential workers in person. So much of that is related to this undocumented status, but also, again, healthcare workers at the very high levels who do have legal status, our doctors, nurses, and so on, bore the brunt of the pandemic. I think another area worth highlighting, and this is certainly beyond the report because it's not so much about labor markets, is the impact of school closures. And this is a big difference between a lot of European countries and the United States. And these were very local decisions when to close schools, and in particular, how long to keep them closed and when to reopen them. And higher income and U.S. Native families, that have more resources were better able to, I think, deal with school closures in terms of navigating, moving their children potentially from public to private schools, or supplementing the very limited online schooling that was available because the parents, speak English and had access to more resources and so on. Whereas for immigrant families, particularly low-income, non-English speaking families with children at home, while remote schooling was going on, these families were just really sort of left in the dust in many ways and weren't able to navigate this system and supplement the limited instruction that their children were getting. And this is a problem that's going to be with us, the repercussions of this for a generation. And I think that's a big difference, again, beyond the report, but that is very much centered at the local level and something local policies now need to begin to remedy and address. And perhaps that's something the panelists, once we've addressed some other questions, would like to chime in on.
So thank you very much. Indeed, talking about remote work, or actually, in our report we talk about whether remote work could address some of the issues related to concentration of production function factors, especially workers. But one particular area that we see strong local dimension is innovation. And so Sari, who's here, has been working extensively on innovation, and which is crucial for productivity growth. And her work shows that scientists, developers, or all these high-skilled people, they concentrate in very small areas. So my question would be, of course, I don't expect you to have the right answer, but I don't believe we have one. But in your view, what can we do about it, this concentration? Should we let them, it is related to the discussion that we had in the first roundtable, but should we address this concentration, or will it naturally, with the increased real estate price, etc., the cost of agglomeration will overweight the gains of agglomeration? What do you think?
Well, that's a thank you, first of all, inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. And I actually did start my research career as a regional scientist. So this reinforces my feeling that this is another area where a regional lens can really help us better understand things. So thank you for taking this initiative and getting us directed towards that path again. So this is of course, if we look at many countries, small countries, large countries, we don't see an even distribution of economic activity and innovation in the countries. We tend to see these very concentrated areas where both native inventors and immigrant inventors concentrate in. It seems to be something that is naturally arising, and it seems to be something that's also is productivity enhancing. Again, as you mentioned, we don't have a perfect answer as to whether, first of all, whether we should do something about it. Like we don't know exactly what the agglomeration elasticities look like. Whether we would be better off trying to having tried to have split the Silicon Valley into 3 Silicon Valleys, would that have led into somehow better outcomes than having what we have now? Or in smaller countries like Finland, we had a major concentration around Nokia in a couple of places, actually some of them pretty remote places. Should something have been done about that, or was that a good thing for the national economy? I think really, like, again, this requires a lot more study and a lot more trying to understand some of the regional aspects. The most closely related study that comes to my mind was actually by Enrico Moretti, that shows that the inventors, if they move to a city where there's a large cluster of other inventors in the same sort of field, their inventions become more and better, right? So it seems like there's definitely some productivity enhancing aspect of that. But that being said, we do see countries sort of worrying, trying to think about, I mean, we should really have another agglomeration center. We should somehow like factor one out of nothing. The efforts to date I don't think we have any fantastic examples of that being a very feasible strategy. Josh Lerner wrote a nice book about some of the efforts that have gone not so well, and some of the lessons that perhaps could be learned if policymakers really want to go down that path. But most of the efforts have not been successful, mostly because it's all of this is sort of centered around entrepreneurship, and the understanding of the entrepreneurial process is not necessarily something that the policymakers even can handle, and sort of that I think if one wants to go towards that direction, then entrepreneurship is the key piece that we need to understand. Not I don't necessarily endorse going down that direction, actually.
Excellent, thank you. So yes, I have a follow-up question. I mean, hopefully we'll have time to ask you about a bit entrepreneurship of migrants, because this is an understudied area. But I see that Giovanni is raising his hand. Please, Giovanni.
Very quickly, following on Sari's point. So I think there are two things super interesting on immigration and concentration, which I think we're still trying to understand, and I think are very consequential. One is that immigrants are even more concentrated. So the economic activity is super concentrated in countries, and innovation is one of the most concentrated activity. But immigrants are overrepresented, massively overrepresented in these very large metropolitan areas. I mean, people who in the US, 12% of the population is immigrant. In the top 10 metropolitan area, 30%. In Los Angeles, which is the largest in New York, 45% are immigrants. So there is this incredible concentration. And we're still trying to understand exactly why. In part is because they work in the knowledge economy, but even the low-skilled immigrants are way more concentrated in large cities. So number one, this is something to be understood and is a potential, which is very important. Number two, I think that the recent research is showing that high concentration, there is the other actor which is important in the high concentration, and those are firms. So concentration is a concentration of firms, and a lot of evidence shows that not only in large city and large dynamic cities, there are also the best firm, the firm which have higher productivity, they pay higher salary, and that's part of the reason why immigrant and everybody moves there. So in a sense, as Chalar said 100% correctly, concentration is an outcome. We need to understand what are the forces behind it, but there are certainly some characteristics of immigrants and their mobility that generates this concentration. And also the other side is concentration also means better firm, higher productivity firms. And this is something that we need to account when we think about this.
Thank you. Sorry, I think you want to add a point, or?
I have a very quick point to add, if I may. Yes, so it is absolutely true. So immigrants are even more concentrated. They go to where jobs are, they go to where amenities are, and they tend to go to where other immigrants from similar backgrounds are. And again, firms, entrepreneurs have a huge role in that, because immigrants find it easier to find jobs in firms that were founded, at least in part, by other immigrants that come from same cultural or linguistic backgrounds. And I think it's all just sort of really feeding into that extra concentration.
Thank you. Christina, please.
I just wanted to provide a small counterexample to that. So Germany is kind of interesting. I mean, of course, you have also the concentration, but you also have a lot of very strong companies that are scattered, especially in the southeast and the southwest, so Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg. In there, you have the phenomena that you have literally labor shortages of these world leaders in certain industries, And so there is something else beyond the job that seems to be keeping the flow of people who could fill these jobs in these areas, because they would, I'm sure, pay good money, but they still have the problem of getting them. So, you know, I think understanding how one can sort of help alleviate these barriers or increase the attractiveness beyond the job, the well-paid job, I think is important.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask one of the questions that, because it came up again in the chat, it was also asked in the first, something related was also asked in the first round table, and I know that there's several of you have worked on these topics. So going back to these refugee crisis and refugees overall, there is evidence so far on the effective policies to promote their economic and social integration. But what is the role of local economies? What is the local dimension in your view? So please feel free to jump in. Giovanni, please.
Yeah, so this is a very important question on refugees, focusing on refugees, and which are very different type of immigrant, as we said. And so I have been involved in this kind of a long run analysis of refugees in Denmark and trying to study the effectiveness of the very many different policies that Denmark, as a several Scandinavian country which have been incredibly active, have tried. And very few people have evaluated in a clean, causal way. And so that's what we were trying to do. And I would say two things emerge, in my view, from their research on the local role, the role of local authority and on what is effective. So number one, one of the most studied feature of refugee is the consequence of where they're first placed. There is in many countries this policy of placing refugees in a little bit of a random way, or at least if you, and this is very good in a sense for a causal type of analysis, although is terrible if you really want to try to maximize. And there is, I would say, very large evidence that there are a few local factors that if the refugees placed there initially are going to be have a positive and permanent impact. One, placed in dense, large area with high employment rate and low unemployment rate. So the local economy matters a lot. And two, the network of other people who are coming from the same countries. This is a little bit more sort of as plus and minus, but certainly seems to have pluses. Plus, another thing that has been analyzed is that many of the training program, in particular language training program, which seem to be impactful and seem to be particularly impactful in finding employment and in earnings, if they are combined with an initial urban location. So you teach languages, and this language improve the opportunity of these people, but are the large urban market are where some of these more language intensive type of job are found. And let me be clear, it's not that by teaching language to a refugee, you make him go from an agricultural worker to a nuclear engineer. But the type of jump in job is that most of them find job in sector which are like cleaning services, household services, but with a little bit more language, they will find the jobs instead in personal care, elderly care, healthcare, which number one are jobs that we need massively, and number two are jobs we pay a little bit better and are a little bit more stable. So language plus urban location. The third very interesting policy that at the local level, some Danish places have set in place, which I think has been very useful, and it gets to many of the things that we discussed, is this idea that the training, or that there is a shortage on one hand for some jobs. So here we're not talking about high-skilled job. We're talking about care of the elderly, care of the disabled. Or for some job there is shortages. And then there are some refugees which have a hard time to find jobs. So some of these policy we're trying to match in a clear, so give information and matching, quick training, matching shortages with the refugees. And I thought this was a brilliant idea, because we keep talking about there are some jobs that, you know, native don't want to do, on which there is a shortage, and there are some refugees which are struggling to find success, and they have set in place, and these have all been set up at the local level by municipalities, sometimes public-private partnership, and we are evaluating a program like this. It seems quite interesting actually to me, and so language, some of this targeting and placing them at the beginning in the right place seem to me important policies.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for these great points. Madeline, I think you want to also. Yeah.
Sure. I would say more than placing people in the right places is allowing them to move and to make decisions to go where they have friends and family or where they perceive the best opportunities for them. And with this particular refugee flow and this very upsetting, and horrifying and tragic situation is because it is women and children, the importance of providing childcare and educational opportunities for these children that will help allow the mothers to work or get training. That's going to be very important. I'll post a link in the chat in a minute when I'm done talking, of a really interesting paper by Adriana Kugler and Josh Angrist a couple of decades ago, looking at what might be perceived as a somewhat similar refugee flow, although not as much women and children as everyone, out of the Balkans in the early 1990s, again into Europe, where what they found that helped those Balkans refugees do better in European labor markets was less regulation of both labor markets in the destination countries, but importantly, product markets as well. And that having more market dynamism really cushioned the impact of a large refugee inflow for existing natives and helped those refugees do better. And perhaps there are some lessons there for all of us destination countries.
Thank you. Yeah, indeed, that is one of the, I guess, few papers where we have this cross-country nature. Of course, not subnational, but it's one of the earliest examples where we have an episode of refugee crisis, but looking at how the integration varies across countries and linked to the institutional institutional setup of each country. Christina, please.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add one point to I think the discussion, and I think for refugees, the time and the perspective with respect to time is crucial. So I think one of the lessons we learned from the refugee crisis or situation a couple of years ago is if you make people wait and they're in a situation where they don't know what their status is, what their perspective is, where they will go, where they will stay, where they can build something new. I think that sort of destroys a lot of the incentives, the enthusiasm, the willingness to start from scratch. And many of these people have some traumatic experiences. So my feeling is the worst you can do is to have them sit around and not do anything and not feel they can constructively build something new and leave the past behind. And so obviously, the big refugee flows we are expecting now put some challenges on the administration, but I think that is crucial that we give people a perspective and a perspective fast because they need to move on at some point. And even if they return, I think it's still better to use the time productively rather than sitting around.
Yeah, definitely. So Chala, because he has a beautiful background, he gets to have an extra say. Chala, please.
Just want to add something. So my nephew just defended his dissertation in math, and I used to be an engineer, so I looked through his dissertation, and there's this Fourier analysis where you have two different kind of waves that merge, and it creates this complex pattern. Migration feels that way. We have the underlying demographic productivity differences which are creating economic migration, right? Whether low skilled or high skilled. And this is a pretty steady, predictable flow in many ways, right? But then there are these shocks, sporadic, uncertain, unpredictable, which are the refugee flows. And then the policymaker and the public looking at this, the people coming to your border, and it's just chaos. Right? So the first thing, critical thing for both academics and policymakers is try to separate these two and not let them confound each other. I worry that's what happened with Brexit. Right? It's basically, we don't like all migrants. right? Or they're ruining the thing, but they are completely different phenomena, and the policy responses need to be different, and the analysis needs to be different. And well, I'll give you one specific example. If you look at Ukraine today, the people, young men bring their wives and their children to the border and they stay back. Economic migration is the exact opposite. The young man goes with the wife and the children staying behind, right? So it is very important to have different policy mechanisms, especially in the labor markets, when you're facing these two completely different kind of flows. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Cem. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Çağlar. So, Sari, before I let you make your comment, I'd like just to say that I want to ask one final question after her intervention, something that's quite important for us, and we can benefit from your experience. So, Sari, please, your answer.
Thank you. I think with refugees, many exact right things were said, and it's certainly the case. We should do all of the things that we should do in general: recognize degrees and qualifications, provide additional training if needed, language training. Don't force people into remote locations, because that hasn't ever seemed to have worked really well, or at least allow them to migrate where they need to go. But not just for refugees. I think I've been approached by several countries who want to attract skilled immigrants, and they ask me what they should do. And I mean, first of all, you should let them come, right? Like, we have lots of immigration policies that make it so hard to come, and then you ask, like, how can we attract them? Well, let them come in. Don't stop them from working. We have many, again, visa schemes where we have let one family member work, but the others are not allowed to work, and they may be just as highly skilled as the one member who is allowed to work. We should think about who are already there. Like, foreign students are often forgotten. They might be sent out with talking about Brexit. The US is one other prime example. We take in a large numbers of students, we educate them, and then we don't have a very great system of letting them stay, at least for long term. So there's, for refugees and immigrants alike, if we want them to be coming and staying, then we should make it possible.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to ask one final question, and we're running slightly out of time, so we don't have to, I mean, if you can have a few of you answer it, it could also be fine given the time constraint. But as you've seen in this report, we tried to look at the subnational dimension of migration and how it affects local innovation, labor markets, and trade and productivity. But there are still many missing pieces of evidence at the subnational level. In your view, if you had to pick one or two areas where we need to further our understanding, what would those areas be? I mean, please go ahead, Giovanni. I don't know. I mean, I lost. Yeah, go ahead, Giovanni. I lost track there. So in your view, was first.
Madeleine was first.
Go, please.
Well, thank you. I'm not going to talk about a topic, but I'm going to put in a desperate plea, or just to raise awareness, that the current population survey, which is one of our biggest data sources in the US, is now doing what they're calling geographic suppression. So we will not know as detailed of a level where people are. And so this goes against the entire point of this report, which is, again, just so fascinating and so full of rich detail. And so it's troubling that we are going to be more limited in our ability to do analyses like this from US data. And of course, privacy is important, but we need more information. And I'm worried we're going in the wrong direction in so many ways, including that. I'll step off my soapbox now.
Thank you. Giovanni?
So I would two things, I think. So first of all, the thing that you looked at are the right things to look at first, I would say. So you got that definitely right. A couple of things on which we need to know more, I think, are becoming very interesting. One is entrepreneurship of immigrant, firm creation. It's clear, it's overwhelming evidence that there is a lot of immigrants who are entrepreneur, and the data on entrepreneurship are always a little bit clunkier and harder to find. So that's one important, and this is connected with firms, how firms respond and react, and what is the margin of adjustment to immigrant, how firms that hire more immigrants. So something sort of on firm response. And then the third, I would say, is local public goods a little bit, a sort of an analysis of how immigrants affect probably local schooling and local healthcare are the most relevant on both as customer and as producer of them. I find that fascinating because there is a high concentration of immigrants in healthcare, and education, of course, is very much affected. So in the wish list, I guess I would include those.
Thank you very much, Sari.
Sort of more detailed, very detailed measures of human capital that always is on the wish list, and it's always especially hard with the immigrants when they may have had their qualifications from another country, and the way it gets collected varies so much country by country when they arrive. And then the other thing that this may be a high tall order ask, but going kind of back to what we heard earlier, I think it would be really important to know how people arrived, like what is the visa that they arrived under, because that would allow us to much better understand who the people are and why we see what we see, perhaps in the assimilation, in the firm creation. And of course, like what Giovanni said, I do agree that we need more measures of entrepreneurship, not just self-employment, but the actual firm creation type of entrepreneurship.
Excellent, thank you very much. And final word, Christina.
Yeah, I can only add to that. So, having a better information about their skills or the job they did in their origin country would be super helpful. And I think also more basic, trying to make sure that in the big data sources of the countries, we have actually a good measure of migrant background, which in many European countries is still not true. You sometimes have citizenship, but that doesn't mean that if you're a national, you can be naturalized. So I think taking care that these statistics are clean and well followed up, I think is also important.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much. So unfortunately, we have to stop here. I know that we could go on for hours, but we have to move on with the program agenda. So thank you very much, all of you, for this great discussion and all these great ideas. And we'd love to follow up with you on some of these ideas and discuss with you our future work, which try to relate to these some of the aspects that you raised. With that, I leave the floor to Lucas, and thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I can only echo what Jem is saying. Christina, Madeline, Sari, and Giovanni, thanks really a lot for this very insightful and fantastic discussion. And it's certainly, these roundtables really certainly emphasize some of the areas where we need to do more and gave us a lot of food for thought. But now I'd like to invite Rudy Garand, head of the Economic Analysis, Data and Statistics Division at the OECD, to conclude our event. Yeah, Rudiger, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lucas, and thank you very much to all the presenters and the discussants, panelists. I think that was a really very, very rich launch event, very interesting. And my closing remarks will, of course, not be able to do justice to everything that was said, but I will just nevertheless try to pick some areas and also try to give a bit of a forward-looking view that what we can take away from this discussion. One thing I wanted to kind of say that basically everybody was really agreeing on is how important this report is, because he's pointing at the regional dimension of migration, an aspect that's very often overlooked and that's absolutely crucial. And I think therefore this report is really a milestone, and the databases that have been created in the preparation of this report are really a great asset also for others to kind of do further research in that area, to advance our knowledge and to really get a much better understanding of what we need to do at the local level, basically to better integrate migrants, but also kind of how migration and regional development are connected, can be connected, and how this link can be better exploited going forward. Then we talked about some lessons basically from the report, but also kind of that generally are really important, and that are also, I think, are very important when we're looking at the refugee crisis from Ukraine, to basically how to deal with the refugees, because I mean people don't know how long this is going to last, and so we kind of like doing everybody will return, and so we don't do anything is certainly not a good perspective. And that focus is kind of like, which has been stressed by a lot of speakers, the importance when you have migrants is to give them access to the labor market as quickly as possible. And I think all the intervenants agreed that this is really a very important issue, and that policies should be more lenient in that part, because basically I think the worst thing you can do for the integration of migrants is to kind of like keep them locked up for years, basically without any perspective and without any possibility to join the labor market. In that respect was mentioned the role of regulations. If you have more regulations, it will make it more difficult for people to join the labor market. And something that I wanted to mention from the report that has really struck me is the huge gender gap when you're looking at migrant allocation to the labor market. And that really is an area, I mean, we had Women's Day this week. This really is an area where we need to put a lot more focus, and we really need to ensure that we have a better attachment of women who are migrants to the labor market, both for equality purposes, but also because basically we were wasting a huge amount of potential by basically, I mean, having all these women not being active in the labor market. Then also what I found very interesting was the distinction that was made between the social impact and the economic impact of migration, and with the social impact being mainly localized, whereas the economic impact is more kind of like widespread. So basically, I mean, the costs in a way are kind of like more local, and the benefits are more spread out, and that may explain why there is a certain discrepancy in the discourse between kind of like the national level about migration and some people at the local level, and I think that can explain it quite well. And so I think it's really important to understand that better and to be able to better deal with the with potential negative localized social impacts, kind of like I'm ensuring that basically the access to services, for example, is not deteriorating for natives when there's migration in an area and things like that. Then other areas of research that were mentioned is to go beyond OECD countries, and also the impact on origin regions, with the remark that origin regions would also be highly concentrated. And I found that very interesting, and that's certainly something that I think would be worth looking for. And even we as the OECD, I mean, could certainly do some work on this. Then another area that would warrant for the research is the importance of local industrial structures for integrating migrants. Another issue that was raised, and that's also very dear to our heart, is the connection between entrepreneurship and immigration, and we're having a large work stream on SMEs. So I mean, that's something we are really very interested in pursuing, I think, as well. And then we heard some good news that we're basically getting a 1 kilometer grid where we're having basically population data, including data on migrants. So that's also absolutely sorry, that's a very positive news, and that will also enable us to basically make great improvements on the research side. And then basically to conclude, we also had a discussion about the importance of demographics when you're looking at migration. Specifically the question of whether one should try to somehow intervene on how migrants are allocated across space, with the idea that they could be, I mean, useful to helping certain lacking regions or certain areas where population levels have been declining. And there the discussion was rather controversial. I mean, it was more of an agreement that one probably shouldn't be forcing migrants to go to certain places, but then kind of like, I mean, when you're trying to make places attractive, or when you're putting incentive schemes in place, I mean, you're not forcing people, but I mean, you're still intervening. So I mean, it's a question of degree. I have no firm view on that, even though I'm probably more in the not forcing migrants to go to places camp, but I'm observing obviously that a lot of governments are doing that. I mean, that's very popular among politicians, doing these questions. And therefore, I think what is also needed is a lot more research on that, because firstly, it would be important to understand what kind of measures are actually working in this sense. You know, if you're trying to get migrants to settle in certain regions, that they actually first go there and then secondly stay there, because if they go there for a year and then they move something else, I mean, then it's obviously not very effective. And then secondly, also, what are the implications for those regions where the migrants go, and then finally also what are the costs? I mean, the economic costs, and also the social costs of these interventions. I think that's also is a further topic of research that's very important because it's it's very high on the political priority, these interventions. So it's important to understand them. So that were just some areas where this sorry, let me start the sentence again. That was just a collection of some areas of research that the new data that have been collected and the forthcoming will able to shed more light on, and where there's important questions that need to be answered. And I'm encouraging you all to kind of like, I mean, put more efforts and more work in this area so we can shed more light on these questions, because they are really going to be very important to improve how we can benefit, and how also from migration, and also how can how migrants can benefit from when they have been moving in their new places. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you very much, Rudiger. Well, again, on behalf of the OECD, I'd like to really appreciate and express our gratitude to everyone who participated, and in particular to our wonderful speakers. As pointed out, a lot of food for thought, a lot of areas for future work. So we would like to stay in touch and continue this conversation through other projects, other area of work going forward. So again, thank you very much, and have a nice afternoon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.